this notion of being situated, of creating place, of creating communion. I mean, Garces is one thing, Randy mentioned it, like, we have like the most creative thinkers on these ideas, and they're working right now. Like, if you guys, you have to see the piece that Garces is directing, because Marc Bamuthi Joseph, Theater Gates, and Garces together, like those minds are breaking through these walls in 3 totally different ways, and the bananas part about it is they're all doing it in one piece together. But we also have to remember, like, we're just part of a lineage of folks who've already sort of paved this road out. That's what I mean. Like, you don't want to do it to survive. You want to do it to sustain that thing. Like, Rodessa Jones and they already did it before. Luis Valdez and Campesino, they already did it before, right? Roger Ginvir Smith, Culture Class, these people that are taking the history and the modern day thing and smashing it into one thing and breaking open these walls. And I think I say those as sort of not to sort of go like, oh, look at the big star in the sky that can't reach, but that we're in this big thing. This constellation is filled with all of us, and we can make these things happen. I mean, you have to remind, this is one of the things that we have to do. I have to remind myself that, because the workload becomes really hard if you want to do it with any ambition. Or, you know, write your little play and do your thing, and that's cool too. But if you want to do it, if you want to be true to the thing that you're saying you're doing, you really have to work your butt off at it. And it comes with things that are not tangible either. For us too, is like, one of our co-founders, like the heart of our group, he died. It's like, you're like, what? We're supposed to continue after that? You know? And in that way, you see this little microcosm of this little just play group, and you just remember that you're in the real world. Like, his family has to live after he passed away, so I guess the little theater thing has to keep going too, because he died. But it all has to keep passing on, and that's why in some ways it's not even the plays. I did the privilege of doing this thing here at UC Berkeley with the students. And to me, that was the most amazing thing. And forgive me if that sounds like patronizing. It's not. I really mean it. And I mean it because what we did in that session of a semester together is what I try to remind myself, and the title of it was Creating the World You Live In. And I think that's what we all want to keep remembering to do. It's because theater for us is just a way of placing ourselves at the table, because there's so many times that so many people in our family and our neighborhoods and our history, you're not at the table with it. And I think this is just one way to spark that dialogue along. All right, 23 minutes, what happened?
Thank you. I have the privilege of responding, and I think that I'm heartened to have had both of you begin the conversation around this, and so I get the easier job of responding. And in many ways, I also want to pull into this the discussion and some of the ideas that were discussed before this actual panel with a smaller group of other colleagues and thinkers in the field from a variety of different places about the notion of arts engagement, and the idea of reskill, teaching ourselves new skill, the reskill process, given today's world, given the fact that we're in the age of technique, given the fact that we are clearly in a state where interactivity and civic engagement is important, and more with the economy and other cultural turns, this re-asking of and going back to what is the value of arts engagement, what is our role in the world. And to that, my response is wrapped around that, where there's at least 2 questions that I'm constantly wrestling with and have been for the last couple of years in a serious way, and that is, what is the role of arts engagement, and what is its potential, and what is its impact, and what is its potential, and secondly, what are the conditions necessary to make arts engagement happen? And so to the first point, I just wanted to quote a local treasure and editor and visual artist and a dear friend, Jaime Cortez, where Jaime talks about arts and its function quote, artists address the knowledge gap that can only be filled with artists, with their peculiar field research that is irreproducible but constantly duplicated, unverifiable but full of truth. And I think about that notion of art, and I also think about the connections that we're making in our respective projects, but also our backgrounds are our stories, our own subjectivity from Sean's work in arts and aids. And if I believe I'm right, there's patterns to this. Deborah was an MSW, right? She was a Master's in Social Work, wasn't she?
Yeah.
Beforehand?
Yeah.
And to me, it's like kind of like, yeah, that makes sense. And for those of you, as Brandy had mentioned, I spent 17 years prior to my now my 7th year at Urban Warner Center for the Arts on active duty in the fight against AIDS, designing and implementing education models that were all arts-based, and in that process, just in terms of creating an AIDS education program or an approach or a strategy with art, art as the instrument, art is the way of breaking down barriers, art is the salient medium. Not only did I have to me, arts engagement was kind of a no-duh. Like, that's the thing that gets everybody, to attention. And so the idea was, once you've got their attention, how do you get people to change behaviors? And in this case, particularly, safer sex behaviors, to adopt different values, to do all kinds of different things to organize community. Many of the things that we're talking about now that are happening, have happened in the arts in terms of going into communities, whether you're the insider, the outsider, and working to create change, very simply. So I've seen firsthand how arts actually literally saves lives, how art can actually change behaviors. And so by the time I got to YBCA as Ken Foster, our executive director for the last 8 years, always joked in hiring me, which is usually strange. I think it's like 17 years of public health experience and director of community engagement. He says, well, he designed successful programs for immigrants of color around AIDS. How hard can art be? And over the last 7 years, I realized how hard art can be, and had gained a real respect from this end of the mirror, what it means like to create change from this end, working with the artists and the values and institutions that are different from those of public health and social justice. But I think in the 7 years, there's been a merging that's happened where I feel like I'm so glad that I got my training in public health, particularly in program design, implementation, and evaluation. I think in terms of social sciences, particularly the field of AIDS, which is now 30 at this year, 30th year in this 2011, this was an artist design movement, not starting with Grand Fury and on. These were artists who started these nonprofit organizations, who surrendered their practices and went on to become executive directors, thinking that initially there was going to be a cure, right? But a lot of the innovation in AIDS that spilled over into public health and into our larger lives really came from artists. So in that, I am deeply convinced that and I know for a fact about how art can create the impact that we're looking for. So the other question that I've been wrestling with is, what are the conditions that create arts engagement? And I was talking to Amanda earlier about this, right? It was a good thing, because Amanda Eicher, who's here, and she mentioned wonder and like the way that, because I talked a little bit about how artists have all of these various X-Men powers or superpowers, right? That are not just about the end result in terms of our plays or the work we do in the community, but some aspect, some tendency that whether we do it on the dance floor or we do it in exhibitions, some pulsing talent, some kind of thing that keeps coming up, that what I call it our superpower that keeps it going. And one of those things is creating wonder. Like, artists can do a lot of different things. Artists can create synesthesia, all of like the cool things about art. And I'm wondering about how can causing great emotion, how can creating wonder, and how can sparking curiosity, those all have practical applications in the world. So I think about that and I think, well, I think about it also in the context of our youth arts program, and I think, okay, for 7 years I've run a program, an award-winning after-school program that basically teaches young kids, young artists how to be better artists and to go to college. And I mean, it's great. I don't want to, but I'm actually thinking now, is that enough? Is that enough? It's like, are we creating, and I feel like a lot of youth arts organizations are like this, and I'm looking at the mechanism itself, and I'm wondering if it isn't, and this is what I'm trying now, if there isn't a way to harness or capture or work with creative intelligences to create an arts residency experience where we can give them the quiver, we can give them the artist's quiver, right? So that irrespective of, whether or not they want to be an artist or an arts administrator, that they are using creative innovation. They're using creative theory. They're drawing from finishing an arts residency and the way that built them up to be the scientist they want to be the gaming designer they want to be, because they've been trained in the artist's way. So what I was mentioning earlier, I always think about coming up with like the wizard school pedagogy, right? That includes all of the things we've already learned around this, but also goes a little deeper and looks at creative theories and see how we can, okay, Sean, instead of doing you come in and talk about synesthesia. How do you, as an actor and director, how can you make that happen, right? Or how can Cornerstone, what ways does theater make cause great emotion, inspire great emotion, right? And then being able to apply those to potential careers that are limitless, beyond the arts and including the arts, right? So I want to go back to the second question on what are the conditions of arts engagement as well. And I'm feeling like, in many ways, a lot of what I'm supposed to be doing is curating education. And I was just reminded again by my boss last week that he did not hire me to be an education director. He hired me to be an engagement director because we are not doing education in the ways that we normally do. And so how am I going to do that? And so my answer this particular year, in this particular term, is, well, we've got to set the conditions for people to engage in the art. And more often than not, it is not in more information or mediation or contextualization. In many ways, it's as simple as how do you create an environment? How do you convey the ritual of arts engagement that first involves presence? How do you create a quiet or a stillness for people and to even communicate to them? You're bringing with you your day when you come into our galleries. So right now I'm experimenting with a space that kind of looks more like a day spa, right? It's just like, how do you ring this bell and just quiet down? And with all of these short, simple messages like be present, like look at your body in the mirror and see how it breathes. And just to get people to focus on these things, that they have a body and they have a day and all of that to come in with, I think it's the beginning of something. And then you can hit them with the gazillion million different ways. You want to create context, whether it's in the playbill or some fancy thing with Twitter, they're ready. So, and that's just one example among other programs that I've been thinking about that really set the conditions for engagement, because to my former point, because that engagement is an incredibly important moment. Because once you've made that connection with folks, you will get them to do things, and they will do things on their own, like rewrite your play and perform it in another conference, right? They will do things on their own, and once you connected with somebody and art changes them in some way, it's done. And we know that. So those two things I'm thinking about, and you guys definitely have inspired that kind, these ideas again. And so I want to throw it open now to you all to think about, to share any comments you might have, or questions you have around the projects that have been discussed.
Thank you, Joelle.
So, a couple of things. I was struck by the difference in how you both view community, and you alluded to this question in your opening remarks about how we define community, but also using how we define community, how you define community as a way to establish the platform in which we work. And I think it's one of the sort of interesting dialogues going on today about the global platform that we now are so engaged in versus our immediate community. And in a way, Cornerstone is trying to have maybe not a fully global, but connect with community in a way that isn't so place specific, even though the topics that you might address in a place are very specific to that place. Where you've talked a lot about the tension between your very deep-rooted connection to a very physical place and how leaving that is challenging you to rethink your platform. And I just want to maybe throw the question back a little bit and ask if you could elaborate a little bit on how that, and how now that you have a new place, how you think about the social networking, the global platform, you're working with Hub, you're working with these people who are engaging in very different ways about thinking about the place. And I wonder if that's changing your own definition of community and how you might be thinking about new platforms.
Well, I mean, I love the way that you define community. I mean, I think part of it comes to, like, us all. Joel said the same thing too in a different way. We just have to constantly redefine things, because you have to break them back open again as the world changes and as your place changes. And I think ones that we know really well are gut, like community, neighborhood. You start to know the edges of them less if you don't come back to them, sort of, if you aren't rigorous about that, and I think our situation is heightened insofar as we actually are in a new neighborhood. So just by very definition, you have to redefine it, resurvey, remap where you are. But I think it comes at a good time, because you have to do that all the time. And I think it's interesting. I think we have the same conundrum quest insofar as I think for a lot of times, I think from the outside in, if you do something about your neighborhood, people therefore thus say, oh, they did their little thing about their little neighborhood. But obviously you're doing something about a neighborhood because it transcends blocks, it transcends neighborhoods. And I think in a both purposeful and unconscious way, I think some of the projects we're doing both have to be positioned bigger and have to be defined and sort of challenged in a different way. I mean, we're working with Richard Montoya on a project that is situated in the southeastern border of the state, so like Calexico, eastern San Diego Caves, things like that. We're working with Luis Alfaro on something that travels Highway 99 when there. And I bring up those as examples of, we first of all have to actually get ourselves out of our own city. And so, but those bring about more questions, like then how do you bring those stories back here, or how do you expand that back out? And I don't have the answer to them, that's for sure, yet. I think it's more the framing, and I think Joelle stated it really well too, in terms of like what are the terms and the conditions that we're agreeing to? What is the scope of the work? Because there's a part of the work when you just want to connect with people that it becomes about this and this, instead of sort of setting your sights in a different way. And I think we're tasked to that much more now, I mean, just by virtue of being in a different place. I think it feels right now like there's more pressure, but I think that just means that we need to underline what we're doing better. I mean, that's really what I'm trying to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Shannon's talking about is definitely mirrored in a lot of the conversations we have internally, because we are constantly wrestling with, what do we mean when we say community? What does it mean to be a community engaged theater company? Should we call it that? Should we call it something else? Do we like this word community? Are people meaning the same thing by it? Are they appropriating it? I mean, this is constant conversation. When Cornerstone started 25 years ago, it was really about they were very specifically working in rural communities and defined by geography. So they were going to small towns across the country and working, North Dakota, Texas, etc. And specifically, looking for communities that where professional theater making had not been part of the ecology for many years ago. And then they finally decided to land somewhere, and they landed in Los Angeles and began working in neighborhoods. And then that has evolved. They started defining community by job, they defining community by religion, et cetera, et cetera. And when I came to Cornerstone, we did this piece looking at it somewhat differently, because generally speaking, when you enter a community as defined by space, you kind of talk to people about what people are wrestling with, and then you find out what the topic of your play is going to be. And when we started working with communities looking at issues of justice, we kind of had the inquiry. We knew we wanted to look at reproductive rights, or we wanted to look at the prison system stuff, and then we started finding the communities that had been disrupted by this particular issue, would come together, be created because of the issue, et cetera, and we're working our way in. And then, of course, all that we get problematized, we come out the other end with something that, we did a piece about reproductive rights, and at the end of the day, a lot of people questioned whether the piece wasn't actually about reproductive rights. And I was like, yeah, totally, but that was the conversation we had with this wide range of people, and then, at the other end, they were talking about something that was not what you'd imagine going in, or at least what we did. And in how, and we still in Summers do work that's more looking at geographically based communities, and so we kind of have both practices happening. But we've been thinking about it, and these labels or these phrases are really about how we enter thinking about community, not about the communities themselves per se, but we have to be thinking about something as we're talking about it, right? And so I think that Cornerstone entering it, and for many years was talking about theater, what we call communities, based on circumstance, communities of circumstance. They were thinking about what people's circumstances were as how it defined community, right? And that's how they were entering the conversation. I think lately we've been thinking about community as what are the choices people are making, communities of choice, and entering the conversation based on that, which is a really different way for us to enter the conversation. It's more about our process and how we're entering it, less necessarily about how people self-define. And then the question becomes, how do you self-define, and who are the majority and majority voices, and where, but it's a constant and probably the hardest and also most interesting part of the work is how we define it and how we define ourselves within that conversation. Are we looking at the state? We're going to be doing a statewide tour looking at issues of hunger and food equity, across the state, and how do we sustain sort of local input into something that's touring across the state, and how do we think about community in that context and a larger statewide conversation? So we're constantly wrestling with that.
Well, I think Garces brings up a good point too. I think a lot of groups are looking at this challenge now too. Like, how do you look outside without leaving behind your neighborhood? If that makes sense. You guys are going to hear from Theaster Gates later, and Theaster does it in a totally different way. Like, he purchases land in the neighborhoods, and that's amazing, right? I think in some ways, just the way the arts organizations run, part of how we ended up not in the mission anymore is because of the inability to do what something like a champion like Theaster did. And so then once resituated, you have to sort of resituate your goals, and then how are you going to make that impact? And impact seems to be, maybe you'll see me in 3 months and I won't be saying the word as much, but I think it's in the head a lot, because if you don't know the person, like we're on Mission and Fifth, you don't know the people that live on Minna, which is the street right behind it, which is basically SROs and Dolphin hotels. If you don't know them, then who are you talking to? Then what do you mean when you say like intersection is at Fifth and Mission? What does that mean? Then what does place mean? And so you have to, at both times, sort of, you have to start the actual handshaking, but at the same time, like keep that impact scope wide out there. But you need those terms and conditions. Like, what does it mean? Like, that's really specific to statewide work, and I think we need to refine it in some ways. I'm going to steal Garces' notes later, give back to my boss at the end of the day. Be like, I worked all day today. But in terms of like, how do you make impact? And I think that's a question for arts groups and artists too. It's like, if that's what you want to do with your stuff, and I'm not saying that everyone needs to do that, then how do you define that? And I don't think I know the answers to that anymore. I have to know them anew or redefine them. And I think that's what like new partnerships, whereas it made sense for us to partner with USpeaks and 826 Valencia. We're not going to lose that, but then what does it mean when you're at Fifth and Mission and you're working with, within it with different communities? How do you partner with those groups? So how do you get outside of not just the arts organizations, but how do you make a wider impact, a sustainable impact?
I can check.
Okay, good.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much. It's been a fantastic, incredible conversation. And my question is about, of course, there's always the like process versus product dynamic and community-based thing. But I want to ask about aesthetics. And we're living in a society where there is a canon, Shakespeare, Broadway. In the world of theater, there are these kind of traditional, old school standards of what good art is or high art is or whatever. And I'm curious about how you all kind of both reach for a really high level of quality in the work that you create, but also kind of redefine what the aesthetics are based on the communities and the people and kind of the grounded process. We're not in New York, right? So what does it mean on the West Coast? We're in these different neighborhoods. How does that shape and influence your vision of high quality aesthetic theater productions?
Well, we talk about this a lot. My first response to that is it's a false dichotomy. I often question how the fully professional theater companies have been doing it for many years, or commercial companies are actually talking about standards, and if they're talking about standards, and how they're keeping their quality high. I think this idea that polish and skill equals excellence is problematic. You know what I mean? So as an artist, whatever context I'm working in, I focus on the nature of the inquiry and having as rigorous an inquiry as possible, pushing people hard on the questions and deep on the questions that we're doing, whether we're doing it in a small town in the Central Valley, or whether we're doing it in New York or wherever it is. And so, I think it's in terms of aesthetics, it's really about pushing your inquiry as hard as you can and as well as you can. And so that's what we do in the context. The people, like the folks who have never been on stage before, folks who everybody's watched Glee. Everybody knows what has a sense of the terminology. But I'm talking about people from a wide range, many of whom have never done theater before. They don't want to suck. They will come to me and be like, "Don't be easy on me. I don't want to be bad. I want this to be good." And I'm like, "Believe me, so do I." So people want to be pushed, and we push as hard as we can. It looks different sometimes, And so it is. If your notion of quality is intricately and sort of unbreakably linked to having a stentorian voice and whatever, then you're probably not going to dig it, and that's cool. But it's about looking at the honesty and the truth that's happening on stage, and whether you actually vibe with that or not. And that's what we seek to do. And in terms of aesthetics, in terms of a different aesthetic here as opposed to every community, every conversation is totally about that. It's like, what is the truth of this community? What is the voice of this particular thing? What is the style that's going to suit that? It's a constant back and forth. And we don't always succeed in finding the balance that clicks. And when it clicks, it's beautiful. When it sucks, it really sucks. It really sucks a lot. Because if you don't have that polish to fall back on, you have a mess. It's a beautiful mess, but it's a mess. And I'm good to walk that. So I'd say about 60% of our work pulls together, and it's fantastic, and 40% is fairly painful. That's okay.
I love it. I love it. I think, Joe, also the cool sentence of the day, though, it's the conditions of the engagement. And I think the same goes for the performance aspect of it, or the work. And I think you're right. The aesthetics are informed by the inquiry. by the community, by the question, by the people. So you're not going to put some big bright lights if people don't like big bright lights. You know, you're not going to put like hella loud music if it's some quiet shit. You know, and just on a basic way, like, do we play around with music as a form of narrative because we like music? Partially, but it's also because of the way music moves us, and because of the impact that has in the room in a different way that the, hello, Michael, how are you today? I'm fine. How it breaks up that structure and it just gets at the question more. I mean, I think it's not sort of unguided that we work with poets, that we take prose writing a lot and try and get at conversations in a bigger way, because what someone like Junot Diaz does in a story, we can try and translate or capture one part of that thing and put it into an engagement, because the inquiry is the same inquiry. And if he's doing it better or is giving us a head start on it, then let's use that. And also, it's new. There has to be a better, deeper, more impactful way to reach people than what the surveys are telling us. You know, there has to be something that at one point people aren't going to go, well, theater is a dying art. Well, yeah, I guess so, but then people still show up and people still tell stories and people still have the need to be heard and express themselves. So I think they're all in that same, you know, we're lucky because we have somewhat, you know, codified thing with this open process. And in doing that, you're going to know, like, is a song cool to express this? Because you're engaging in the inquiry with real people too. Like, why would you sing? I hate songs. Don't sing about our problem like that, or someone's going to go like, oh my God, I never thought about it in that way. That's great, you know. And I also think, like, at a certain point, you just have to keep giving the mic over to somebody else. And if the mic, when you pass the mic around, people are going like, hey man, we don't talk in dialogue. You know, we rap, man. What are you talking about? Like, we don't even talk, man. We battle. Oh, okay, cool. Good to know, you know, instead of going like, well, Garces and I figured out this great nifty scene, you know, figuring out the problems of, you know, the water issue in California. But you can't do it until you really engage it. And that's why we try and do it like way early on, or we try to, we fail often. And I think our percentage is less than yours, like maybe 30%, you know. I'll pull 3 out at every conference. What it was built, the talk was fantastic. But for real, but that's also part of the thing. I was at this other panel with Theaster Gates, and I say his name, like, you'll know what I mean when you hear him speak. He was saying, you know, like, how do you define also the effects of the things when it's new? If it's undefined, like, who are we to say what it is? And, you know, we both sort of ghettoize ourselves and also accelerate ourselves. Like, we make up bullshit. Like, it's called hip-hop theater. I guess, you know, why isn't it just called gathering, you know, with rap in it or not? Like, who makes up the metrics for these other things that end up sort of, you know, and it's like you say, like, why is it cool if Berkeley Rep has a solo show, but when we do it, it's just some dude telling his story? Like, who made up those rules? Who made up those questions? Like, who made up that impact? Who defined those metrics? Because I didn't get that survey on that one, you know, and so there's something about, like, pushing the inquiry, because I would ask the same thing. I'd be like, what is the line of inquiry that you guys are working on? Because I know ours at the top, and if we achieve it or we fail, I'm cool with the outcome of that, because we have more to try. And that's the impact of excellence to me. It's like, what is the dialogue that sparked?
If we can take one more question? Question left? Yeah.
I just wanted to respond to Joelle, because you mentioned that we were talking together, and I'm interested in, as a visual artist, the techniques you use to kind of understand who your audience is and connect with them. And, you know, as Joelle was speaking about wizard school for young artists, or a place where artists can discover their own wizardry, I'm really interested in the wizardry that happens when people actually come to things and make the wonder happen for themselves too. And how we can get in that school as artists, how we can go to that school and learn what those guys are doing when they actually make art work for them in the world where there's tons of stuff happening. There's so much to think about. You do walk in with a life, and how do we as artists go to the school where we can learn what makes one work for those people? Because that is a lot of work to do, and people are doing it all the time. So I'm just really impressed with the techniques that you've made for yourself so that you can spend your time doing that. And I think for those of us who are a little more on the visual arts side of it, it's a real nice education.
I mean, what's interesting about that though, Amanda, too, is that in some ways, I mean, I'm lucky I work at Intersection for the Arts, which is an intersection, but also an intersection of all these different art disciplines too. And so you get to see, like, does the picture move someone more, or does the bass playing move someone more? Or, you know, do people like talking, or do people want to look at the installation? And in a lot of ways, we push the things together too, because again of the line of inquiry, and that informs the aesthetic. But I think what's interesting too is a lot of the visual artists, I mean, I really challenge myself to say, like, I wish I could do what the visual artists do, because it seems much easier. We work with, like, there's this great visual artist who's really more of an activist, but an artist, Fabiana Rodriguez. And Fabiana is able to do things with stencils and posters that can put it in anyone's hands. And I think part of the play making process sometimes doesn't, that's why we're lucky to have open process, because at the end of the day, the play making thing, you still want to be like, it's going to be this many words, man. We can't include all the words. You know, this is just one response to it. Whereas we're trying to figure out ways to populate the world. We work with another artist, visual artist, Evan Bissell, and he created a scenic design that was really about workshops that he did in visual arts that ended up being the scenography for a play. And that kind of thinking is really like breaks open the walls, and for that play, it was the walls, and that kind of thing where you could look up and you go, that's a picture, like, for real. That's a photograph of me on your set, because the play is about race, identity, and families. I am a person of color, and I come from a family, and that's me and my mom in that picture. And that's really cool. And, like, how can you do that for every project is the hardest part. And I think that you guys probably achieve it better, but how do you do that when there's only 2 mics in a play, you know, and you could be like, sorry man, it's just me, Garcessa, talking right now. And that's why I think the work becomes about the questions that you pose around the whole thing, and just know that the play is just one response to the big, big question of it. But there's something about being hands-on that is always so much more empowering to a person than doing like this. Like, go ahead and ask the question. You know what I mean? I don't know. So in other words, I look at people like Victor Cartagena and Fabiana Rodriguez, and they're doing it with visual arts, and the question becomes like, how did they do that on the wall that we can't do on the stage?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so glad that actually the last question was also around what sort of similar language around social engagement and process might look somewhat different depending on sort of what art form you come from, or what sector of, and types of organizations you come from. And throughout the day, we're going to be hearing from people who look at similar questions from slightly different angles and have their own developed techniques. And really what a lot of what we're hoping to do at ARC is to provide opportunities where people who don't usually get to be in the same room together can learn from each other. So hang out, stay with us, return. We're going to have a lunch break now. We were very aware that many who told us they were coming were flying here, coming across bridges to get here. We wanted to be sure that those people had something to fortify them, so that they, and so if you have your name tag, we know you to be one of those people, and we've secured some lunch for you. So my apologies for those who we weren't able to, and hopefully your campus people who can find something to eat. But we really hope that you'll return and join us again at 2 o'clock on the dot to hear from more people. Thank you.
Okay,
So we're so glad you could join us today.
this is a wonderful, wonderful conference. It really relates to the issues that we're discussing in educational context, and also as visual artists, to figure out, what makes art relevant in a larger community. So I think all of these issues were addressed in the conference, and I'm really happy to be here.
I mean, I think that